Somewhere in Texas, there is a place most people will never see. A place hidden behind razor wire, steel doors, and silence. A place where men wake up every single day not knowing if today is the day they die. And the strangest part, some of them have been waiting for over 20 years. Not in a hospital, not in a comfortable room, in a box the size of your bedroom closet. And what happens inside that box, what these men eat, what they're allowed to touch, who they're allowed to talk to, and what happens on the very last day of their lives is something most people have never heard the full truth about. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what it feels like to live on Texas death row. And I promise you some of what you're about to hear will genuinely shock you. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because we cover the stories that most people are afraid to tell, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to the beginning. There is a unit in Texas called the Polunsky Unit. It sits in a small town called West Livingston in Polk County, Texas. If you drove past it, you might not even stop to look. It's just fences, buildings, guards and towers. But inside those walls, right now, as you watch this video, there are men sitting alone in cells. Men who have been sentenced to die. Men who have been told by a judge and a jury that their lives are going to be taken from them by the state of Texas. This is where they wait. This is Texas death row. And the first thing you need to understand is this. The Polunsky Unit is not where executions happen. That's the twist most people don't know. The men on death row don't die where they live. They live in one place. They die in another. And the journey between those two places, that journey is one of the most chilling things we will talk about today. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about the place itself. The Polunsky Unit covers 472 acres of land. That's bigger than some small towns. It has 23 buildings and can hold nearly 3,000 people at one time. But the death row section is separate from everyone else. The men on death row don't mix with regular prisoners. They don't eat in the same place. They don't walk the same hallways. They are kept completely apart. And they wear white shirts with 2 letters stamped on the back. D.R. Death row. Every single day, they wear those letters on their back like a reminder of why they're there. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Death row at the Polunsky Unit wasn't always here. Before 1999, death row was at a different prison called the Ellis Unit. But in 1998, something happened that changed everything. 7 death row inmates escaped. 7 men who were supposed to never leave walked out. It was one of the biggest prison breaks in Texas history. And after that, the state of Texas decided that death row needed to change. The men needed to be more separated, more controlled, more isolated. So they moved everyone to Polunsky. And when they did, they built a system of isolation so complete, so total, that experts who study prisons around the world have called it one of the harshest in the entire United States. So what does that actually look like? Let's start with the cell. The cell on Texas death row is roughly 60 square feet. Now, 60 square feet sounds like a number. So let me make it real for you. Stand in your bathroom. Look around. That's probably close to the size of the space these men live in. A steel door with a small window in it. A concrete wall. A toilet and a sink combined into one metal unit. A narrow bed attached to the wall. That's it. That is the entire world of a death row inmate. No windows to the outside in most cells. No fresh air coming in. Just the hum of the facility around them and the sound of other doors slamming somewhere down the hall. And here's the part that starts to feel unreal when you think about it for too long. These men spend between 22 and 24 hours every single day in that space. Not for a week, not for a month, for years, some of them for decades. There are men on Texas death row right now who have been in that cell, that same 60 square foot box, for over 20 years. Think about that. 20 years ago, you might have been in school, learning to read. Or maybe you weren't even born yet. And there's a man in that cell who has been sitting there the entire time. Now, a lot of people hear this and their first reaction is, good. They deserve it. And that's a fair reaction. These are people who were convicted of serious crimes, terrible crimes, But here's the question this documentary is asking: not whether they deserve punishment. They were found guilty in a court of law. The question is, what does it actually look like? What is the reality, day by day, hour by hour? What does life on death row actually feel like from the inside? Because the truth is more complicated and more disturbing than most people expect. Let's talk about a normal day. Breakfast arrives at around 3 in the morning. Not 7 a.m., not 8 a.m., 3 a.m. A guard slides a tray through a slot at the bottom of the steel door, a slot called the bean chute. The man inside takes the tray. He eats alone, in the dark, at 3 in the morning. Then lunch comes around 10:30 a.m. Then dinner around 4:30 in the afternoon. After that, no more food until 3 a.m. the next morning. That's over 10 hours with nothing. The meals are not chosen by the inmates. They don't get to pick. It's whatever the kitchen is making that day. Some days, it's edible. Some days, former inmates have described it as barely recognizable as food. But eating is not even the hardest part of the day. The hardest part is the hours. After dinner at 4:30 p.m., there is nothing. No activities, no programs, no work to do. Just the cell, the walls, the thoughts. And in those hours, in those long, dark, quiet hours, a man alone on death row is left with only one thing: his own mind. And his own mind knows exactly what's coming for him someday. Now here's where it gets interesting and a little bit strange. Because you might be thinking, okay, but they must have things to do, right? A TV? A phone? A computer? No TV. No phone calls to family. No internet. No computer. What they are allowed to have is a radio. One radio. And books and magazines, but only if they are sent directly from an approved publisher. You can't just mail a book to someone on death row. It has to come directly from the bookstore or publisher, sealed and unopened. Otherwise, it gets confiscated. They can also buy certain items from what's called the commissary. Think of the commissary like a small store inside the prison. Inmates are given a limited amount of money sent in by family or earned through legal settlements, and they can spend up to about $95 every 2 weeks. With that money, they can buy snacks, instant noodles, chips, hygiene products, stamps and envelopes to write letters. And here's something that surprises a lot of people. They can buy a fan. In Texas, in the heat, where summer temperatures can hit over 100 degrees, a fan is technically considered a luxury item. It's called a blue slip purchase, a special approved item. A fan, a small lamp, a hot pot to heat water, a typewriter. Yes, a typewriter, not a laptop, not a tablet, a typewriter, the kind your grandparents might have used. Because that's how they write their legal documents, their appeals, their letters to lawyers and judges and family members. On a typewriter, alone, in a 60-square-foot cell. Now about those letters. This is where something unexpected starts to happen on death row. Something that, when you first hear it, seems almost impossible given where these men are. Some of them develop deep, meaningful relationships through letters alone. Pen pals. Not romantic in most cases, just human connection. People on the outside who find out about death row inmates through advocacy groups or by searching online, and who begin to write to them. And for many of these men, that letter, that piece of paper that arrives through the mail, becomes the most important thing in their week. Because it is proof that someone on the outside knows they exist. It is proof that they are still a person. Visits happen too. On weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. Between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. family and friends can come to see them. But here's what those visits look like. There is a thick wall of glass between the inmate and the visitor. No hugs, no handshakes, no touching of any kind. They talk through a telephone receiver, looking at each other through glass. And that's it. That is the closest a death row inmate can get to the people he loves. For years, sometimes for decades. Some inmates have had children who were babies when they arrived on death row, children who have now grown up, had their own children, and the grandfather has never once been able to hold them. He can see them through glass. He can hear their voice through a phone. That's all. Now, I want you to hold that image in your mind, that man behind the glass, because what comes next is going to change the way you see this entire place. Because everything we've talked about so far, the cell, the meals at 3 a.m., the radio, the letters, the glass visits, That's just Tuesday. That's just a regular day. What happens when something goes wrong on death row is a completely different story. And what happens on the very last day, when the wait is finally over, is something that we haven't even begun to get into yet. There's a room in a different city, 60 miles away. And every man on this death row knows that one day, a door is going to open, and someone is going to tell him it's time to go to that room. What happens between that moment and the moment he arrives there, the exact sequence of events, the phone call he's allowed to make, the last thing he's served, the last person he sees, we're going to walk through every single second of it. But first, there's something else happening inside Polunsky that almost nobody talks about. Something that started quietly, in the background, while everyone was focused on the executions and the sentences and the crimes. Something that several experts have described as a slow, invisible emergency, and it involves the minds of the men inside. Drop a comment right now. Did you know death row inmates in Texas had no TV at all? Most people are shocked by that. Let us know what's surprising you the most so far. There is a word that doctors use when they talk about what happens to a person who spends too long in complete isolation. The word is decompensate. It sounds clinical, cold, like something you'd read in a textbook. But what it actually means is this: a person's mind begins to fall apart. Not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, like a wall that develops a tiny crack, and then another crack, and then another, until one day, without any warning, the whole thing collapses. And the people who study what happens inside prisons like Polunsky say that this is not a rare thing on Texas death row. It is common. It is happening right now. And the system, in many ways, is not built to stop it. Let's talk about what isolation actually does to a human being. The human brain is not built to be alone. From the moment we are born, we need other people. We need voices, faces, touch, movement, conversation. These things are not luxuries. They are not extras. They are as necessary to the brain as food and water are to the body. When you take those things away completely, for years at a time, the brain starts to do strange things. People begin to hear sounds that aren't there. They see shadows moving in the corners of rooms. They lose track of time. They lose track of themselves. Some men on death row have reported talking to the walls, just to hear a voice, even if it's their own. Some have stopped sleeping at normal hours entirely, because in a cell with no natural light and no schedule that changes, day and night begin to feel exactly the same. And some have simply given up. In a 20-year period on Texas death row, there were at least 8 suicides. 8 men who decided that waiting was worse than whatever came next. Now, the prison does have mental health staff. But here's the number that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously that's taken. For nearly 3,000 inmates at the Polunsky Unit, there are just 52 contracted medical and mental health employees. Total, that includes doctors, nurses, and mental health workers combined. 52 people for nearly 3,000 inmates. Do the math and you start to understand why former staff members who worked inside Polunsky have used a specific phrase to describe what they watched happen to the men on death row. They called it puddling, a person puddling, like a solid thing slowly melting into the floor, losing shape, losing structure, losing the thing that makes them a person. One former mental health manager who worked inside Texas prisons didn't use that word lightly. They used it because they watched it happen over and over and felt powerless to stop it. Because the structure of the system, the isolation, the solitary confinement, the 22 to 24 hours alone every day, was the thing causing the damage. And that structure wasn't changing. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. Because you might think, this is a death row, a place for the worst of the worst. So maybe that's the point. Maybe the isolation is intentional. Maybe nobody inside cares. But that's not entirely true. And what's been happening inside Polunsky over the last few years proves it. In 2021, something quietly started inside the death row section of Polunsky. It was called the God Pod. And no, that's not an exaggeration or a nickname invented by the media. That's what they actually called it. It was a program, a faith-based program, 18 months long, open to 28 inmates at a time who applied and were approved to participate. Inside the God Pod, something happened that almost never happens anywhere else on Texas death row. The men were allowed to be in the same space as each other. They could worship together, study together, talk to each other face to face. For men who had spent years, some of them decades, with no human contact at all, being in a room with another living person and being allowed to simply speak to them was described by participants as overwhelming. Some of them cried, not because anything sad had happened, but because a human being had looked them in the eye and spoken to them like a person. That's what years of isolation does. It turns the most basic human interaction into something that feels extraordinary. The God Pod also came with something else unexpected. A radio station, not a real commercial station. A tiny, low-power signal that only reaches inside the unit. Broadcasting number 106.5. They called it the tank. And on the tank, death row inmates through a carefully managed system could hear faith programming, educational content, and messages from the outside world. It was not much. By any normal standard, it was almost nothing. But for men in 60-square-foot cells with nothing but a radio, it was everything. Then in 2024, something even bigger happened. Texas, the state that is responsible for more executions than any other state in America, did something that surprised even the people who follow this issue closely. They launched a group recreation pilot program on death row. For the first time, a small number of death row inmates were allowed to exercise together, watch television together, play games, practice their religion as a group, together, in the same room, without a glass wall between them. People who study prison reform called it a significant shift. Not a solution, not even close to a solution, but a shift, a sign that maybe, slowly, something was beginning to change. But then, and this is the part that made people stop and pay attention, in early 2025, a second version of the program was attempted, and it was suspended. No detailed public explanation was given. It was just stopped. And the men who had briefly been allowed that small taste of human connection went back to their cells, back to the silence, back to the walls. This is the rhythm of Texas death row. Something opens, something closes, a door appears, and then it's locked again before most people even knew it was there. And speaking of doors opening and closing, let's talk about something that sits at the center of every single day on death row in a way that nothing else does. The appeals process. When a person is sentenced to death in Texas, that is not the end of the legal fight. In most cases, it is just the beginning of a long, complicated, exhausting battle through the courts. Inmates can appeal their convictions. They can challenge the evidence. They can argue that their original lawyers made serious mistakes. They can bring forward new evidence that wasn't available at the first trial. And this process takes years, sometimes decades. During that time, an inmate might receive an execution date, a real date, a specific day circled on a calendar that says, "This is the day you are scheduled to die." And then sometimes days before that date, a court steps in and issues what's called a stay of execution. The execution is paused. The date is canceled, and the inmate goes back to waiting. Now imagine what that does to a person. You have spent months knowing that a specific date is coming. Your mind has been living with that date every single hour. You have thought about it when you wake up at 3 a.m. to eat your breakfast through the bean chute. You have thought about it during your 2 hours of recreation in your individual cage. You have thought about it while writing letters on your typewriter, through the long silent hours after 4:30 p.m. when there is nothing else to do. And then the date passes. You're still here, but another date will come. Some men on Texas death row have had multiple execution dates set and then canceled. Multiple times, they have mentally prepared to die. Multiple times, they have been told, "Not today." Psychologists who study this experience have a name for it. They call it a mock execution. And the psychological damage it causes, the trauma of repeatedly preparing to die and then not dying, has been compared to forms of torture in academic research. Not by activists, not by people with an agenda, by researchers. In peer-reviewed studies, this is a documented, studied, measured psychological phenomenon. And it happens regularly on Texas death row. Now, Here's something else that very few people outside the legal world know. The lawyers who handle death penalty appeals in Texas are often overworked beyond what most people would consider reasonable. The cases are enormously complex. The legal history is deep and tangled, and the stakes are absolute. There is no higher stake than a person's life. But the resources available to public defenders handling these cases are, in many documented instances, nowhere near what the complexity demands. There have been cases in Texas, real, documented cases where death row inmates had lawyers who fell asleep during their trials. Cases where evidence that could have changed the outcome was never presented. Cases that were later looked at by outside legal experts who found mistakes so serious that they questioned whether justice had actually been served. Some of those inmates were executed anyway. And this is the part of the death row story that tends to make people uncomfortable no matter which side of the debate they're on. Because most people, whether they support the death penalty or oppose it, agree on one thing: if we are going to take a person's life, we should at least be absolutely certain we have the right person. And the documented history of the Texas death penalty system raises serious, uncomfortable questions about whether that certainty has always been there. But we're not done yet, because everything we've talked about, the isolation, the mental health crisis, the appeals, the mock executions, the letters through glass, all of it leads to one moment. And when that moment finally comes, it doesn't look the way most people imagine it. It starts quietly, with a date, and a transfer, and what happens in those final hours, the exact sequence, the phone call, the room, the people in it, the last thing a condemned man sees before the lights go out. That is what we are going to walk through next. Every single detail. And I promise you, even if you think you know how it goes, there are things in the next part of this story that will stop you completely. Things that happen in those final hours that are so unexpected, so quietly human, that people who hear them for the first time don't know whether to feel disturbed or heartbroken, maybe both. There is a week that every man on Texas death row knows about. A week that changes everything. Not the day of the execution, not the hour, the whole week before it. Because 7 days before a scheduled execution, the prison system quietly shifts into a different gear. The guards start watching more carefully. The logs start getting written more frequently. Every 30 minutes, a guard walks past the cell of the condemned man and writes down exactly what he is doing. Sleeping, sitting, reading, pacing. Every 30 minutes. For 7 days straight. The man inside the cell knows this is happening. He can hear the footsteps stop outside his door. He knows what those footsteps mean. They mean the clock has started. And everything from this point forward has been planned, scheduled, and decided without him. Now, let's walk through it, step by step. Because this is the part that most people have never heard in full detail. And when you hear all of it together, it hits very differently than you might expect. The morning of the execution, something happens that hasn't happened in years for most of these men. Their family is allowed to visit them. Not through glass. Well, still through glass, actually. The glass doesn't go away. There is never a moment of real physical contact, even at the very end. But the visit happens at Polunsky in the morning, before the transfer. And for many inmates, this is the last time they will ever see the faces of the people they love. Some families drive hours to be there. Some come from other states. They sit on one side of that glass wall, and he sits on the other, and they talk through that telephone receiver one final time. And what do you say? And then visiting hours end. And the family has to stand up and walk away. And the man behind the glass watches them go. Then the cell door opens, and the transfer begins. This is the moment that death row inmates have thought about, some of them for 20 years. The moment the door opens and someone says, "It's time." A team of officers arrives. The inmate is searched. He is placed in a vehicle, and a convoy, 3 vehicles, traveling together leaves the Polunsky Unit in West Livingston and heads toward the city of Huntsville. The drive is roughly 44 miles, about an hour on Texas roads, and during that drive, the man in that vehicle is passing through the same world that everyone else lives in. Gas stations, fast food restaurants, people driving home from work, kids in back seats looking at their phones. Normal life, happening right outside the window. A world he has not been part of in years. A world he is being driven away from for the last time. When the convoy arrives in Huntsville, it pulls into the Walls Unit. This is the oldest prison in Texas. It sits right in the middle of the city of Huntsville, surrounded by regular streets and regular buildings. People who live there walk past it every day without thinking about it. But inside those old brick walls, Texas has carried out more executions than any other state in America. The inmate is brought inside. He is strip searched again, fingerprinted. His identity is confirmed one more time, officially, for the record. He is given clean clothes, and then he is placed in a holding cell. This is where he waits for the final hours. And here, something happens that surprises almost everyone who hears about it for the first time. He is brought food. Not the 3M tray slid through a bean chute. Not a cafeteria meal on a plastic plate. Tea, coffee, cookies, served to him while he waits. Now, you might have heard about the last meal tradition, the idea that a condemned prisoner gets to request whatever food they want for their final meal. A steak, a specific dessert, something from their childhood. That tradition ended in Texas in 2011. And the reason it ended is almost darkly funny, in the most uncomfortable way possible. A man named Lawrence Russell Brewer, scheduled to be executed for a horrific hate crime, requested an enormous last meal: 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a meat lover's pizza, a pound of barbecue, 3 fajitas, an omelet, a bowl of okra, a pint of ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge. The meal was prepared and brought to him. He refused to eat a single bite of it. A Texas state senator was so outraged that he pushed through a change immediately. No more special last meals. From that point forward, the last meal a condemned inmate receives is whatever the kitchen at the Walls Unit is serving that day to everyone else. The same food as everyone else. Nothing special, nothing chosen, just food. So the tea and the cookies in the holding cell, those small, quiet things, those are actually among the last personal gestures extended to a man about to be executed in Texas. Now, in that holding cell, the condemned man is not entirely alone. He has access to a chaplain, a spiritual advisor, his attorney. If he has a spiritual advisor from outside the prison, a pastor, an imam, a priest, whoever he has chosen, that person can be with him in these final hours. And since a Supreme Court ruling in 2022, that spiritual advisor is allowed to do something that was previously banned. They are allowed to enter the execution chamber itself. They are allowed to touch the inmate, to hold his hand, to pray over him out loud. Before that ruling, spiritual advisors had to watch from behind a glass window, separated from the person they were there to comfort. After years of legal battles, that changed. And now, in those final moments, a condemned man in Texas does not have to die completely alone and untouched. Someone who chose to be there can hold his hand. Think about what that means. After years, sometimes decades of no physical contact with another human being, the last human touch a death row inmate in Texas might feel is from a spiritual advisor in the execution chamber. For many of them, it is the first time anyone has touched them in years. Now, there is one more thing that happens before the execution: a phone call. The condemned man is allowed to make one phone call to anywhere in the continental United States. One call, as long as he needs. And what happens in that call, who he calls, what he says, how the person on the other end responds is private. Those conversations are not recorded for the public. They are not documented in official reports. They are just 2 people on a phone, somewhere in America, saying whatever needs to be said before the line goes quiet. Some people call their mothers. Some call their children. Some call the one person they've been writing letters to for 20 years, the pen pal who became the closest friend they had, because in a life that was reduced to a cell, and a radio, and a typewriter, That person was the one who kept showing up. And then the call ends. And it is time. The execution at the Walls Unit in Huntsville is scheduled for 6 p.m. The inmate is brought from the holding cell into the execution chamber. The chamber is small, clinical. There is a padded table in the center, shaped to hold a person lying flat, with straps to secure the arms out to the sides. Witnesses are brought into viewing rooms on either side of the chamber. There are 2 witness rooms, one for the victim's family, one for the inmate's family. They are separated. They do not see each other, but they are both watching. The inmate is strapped to the table. The spiritual advisor, if there is one, stands nearby. Allowed to touch. Allowed to speak. A single drug is used in Texas executions. 5 grams of pentobarbital administered intravenously. Pentobarbital is a sedative. At this dosage, it is intended to cause unconsciousness within seconds, followed by death within minutes. The warden asks the inmate if he has any final words. And this is the moment that stops people, because some of them do. Some of them speak for seconds, some for several minutes. Some ask for forgiveness. Some say they love the people watching through the glass. Some maintain their innocence to the very end. Some speak directly to the family of the victim watching from the other room, some with apology, some with acknowledgement, some with words that the families later say gave them something they hadn't expected. Some men say nothing at all. And when the final words are done, or when there are none, the process begins. The drug is administered. The spiritual advisor holds the hand of the man on the table. Within seconds, his eyes close. Within minutes, the movement stops. A doctor enters the chamber and checks for a heartbeat. And then the time of death is officially called. Outside the Walls Unit, there are almost always people gathered on the street. Some holding signs protesting the execution. Some holding signs supporting it. Some standing in silence. Some crying. The street outside a Texas execution looks, in many ways, like a small version of everything this issue brings up in America: the disagreement, the grief, the anger, the relief, the unresolved questions that nobody has fully answered yet. And here is where we need to stop and sit with something important. Because this documentary has not been trying to tell you what to think. It hasn't been trying to convince you that the death penalty is right or wrong. What it has been trying to do is show you the reality. The 3M breakfast through a bean chute, the 60-square-foot cell, the radio that was someone's only connection to the outside world, the letter from a pen pal that became the most important thing in a week, the glass wall between a father and his grandchildren he has never touched, the multiple execution dates that came and went, leaving invisible wounds, the typewriter used to write legal appeals late at night in a silent cell, the God Pod, the tank, the programs that opened and then quietly closed, the 44-mile drive past gas stations and fast food restaurants, the cup of tea and the cookies, the one phone call, the hand held by a stranger in the final moments, because there was no one else allowed close enough to do it. These are the facts, not dramatized, not exaggerated, just what it is. And the question of whether this is justice, whether this is the right way for a society to handle its most serious crimes, is a question that Americans have been arguing about for generations. Texas alone has executed over 600 people since 1976, more than any other state, more than most countries. And right now, as you finish watching this video, there are men sitting in 60-square-foot cells in West Livingston, Texas, who are somewhere in that process. Some are just beginning their appeals. Some have been there for 20 years. Some have a date on a calendar. Some are waiting for a phone to ring with news that will either save them or confirm what they already know is coming. And in every one of those cells, a man wakes up at 3 a.m. when the tray slides through the bean chute, eats alone, in the dark, and waits. That is Texas death row. That is how it works. And now you know. If this documentary made you think, even if it made you uncomfortable, that means it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories we tell here are the ones that most people never look closely enough to find. And drop a comment below what was the one detail in this entire video that hit you the hardest. We read every single one.